Welcome to Blessed Man Meditations. My name is Andy. On this YouTube channel, I offer thoughtful responses to skeptical objections to the Christian faith. I likewise edify the saints by equipping them to provide an answer for the hope that lies within them. I hope that you find value in my work. Please like my videos, send me comments, and please subscribe. Let's work together to contend earnestly for the faith that's been once for all delivered to the saints. This is Blessed Man Meditations, where we provide answers to the intellectual side of Christianity and equip Christians to provide a defense for the hope that is in them. Today on Blessed Man Meditations, we continue our look at Is Atheism Dead by Eric Metaxas. Here's Eric Metaxas, a best-selling author, written for the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and the Wall Street Journal. A while back, Metaxas wrote an article that was published in the Wall Street Journal about how science is increasingly making a case for God, and many principles, scientific principles that certainly point to theism are discussed in this book, Is Atheism Dead? Part 1 of Is Atheism Dead covers the scientific material and asks the question, does science point to God? Today we're looking at Chapter 5, and we're looking at how water and sunlight are fine-tuned on this planet to show that our planet is fine-tuned for life. First, we're going to discuss water. So until writing Is Atheism Dead, Eric Metaxas was blissfully ignorant of the superlative strangeness of water. So Metaxas imagines that you and me, the reader, will be confronted, when we're confronted with this idea of how strange water is, we may be put off, wondering whether he wishes to wade into what might be a murky chapter full of strained points on a subject that is too strange to be serious. He doesn't think that many people take seriously the issue of water and its fine-tuning and how it points to a fine-tuner. After all, it's just water. How weird can it possibly be? Having discovered the strangeness of water only recently, Metaxas is sympathetic to the view that people would be skeptical that water would be strange, would be something that we could look at to point to a creator. Who among us would ever imagine that water could be anything but extremely normal in every way? I mean, it's the largest component of what our bodies are made up of. It's what we consume by drinking it, gallons per day, and it is a substance that so much of our lives is dependent upon. So sure, we take it for granted because there appears to be an abundance of it, and we use it for so much. We are, in a sense, somewhat like a fish who doesn't realize that it's wet. We don't realize that we use water and are dependent on it for so much. Like air, too, in its purest form, water is perfectly clear, and it is essentially odorless and tasteless. So what is there to say about water? There is it not the unavoidable standard by which we measure every other liquid? Every other liquid is compared to water. And what does it do other than what we expect it to do? What curious properties might water have of which we are unaware? What don't we know about water? We probably don't think about that much. We all know that sometimes water evaporates into clouds, which eventually turn into rain, and that rain turns around and rains down on us. And then it would sometimes freeze and turn into snow and even ice, which then melts, and that creates streams and rivers which run to the sea. It can be very picturesque and comforting, but how in the world can anyone think of the substance water as anything more than perfectly ordinary? Just as most of us have not goggled at the seemingly identical sizes of the sun and moon in the sky, nor have gushed with gratitude that Jupiter and Saturn pull giant flying objects away from our heads, we would hardly imagine there is any reason to think much about water. Of course, the issues with Jupiter and Saturn pulling giant flying objects away from us and the size of the sun and the size of the moon. Those were issues that were previously discussed in Atheism. Is Atheism Dead? In other places in this work by Metaxas. It's certainly its centrality, that is, water's centrality to our lives is such a given that it is inevitably and not inappropriately mostly ignored. After all, 71% of the surface of Earth is covered with this liquid substance, and 65% of our bodies consist of water. Our brains and our hearts are 73% water. So if absence makes the heart grow fonder and familiarity breeds contempt, it seems only natural that we should take water for granted. In the spoiled modernity of the West, few of us have ever been thirsty for long, nor gone without a shower or a bath for very long, because water is not exactly a scarce resource, at least in 21st century Western civilization. We are otherwise generally unappreciative of water and indifferent to it, and why shouldn't we be? So now we're going to look at the wilderness of water, or H2O. If you come across The Wonder of Water, a work by the British-Australian biochemist named Michael Denton, who makes regular appearances in Is Atheism Dead, you will discover things that you cannot have imagined about water, and will almost certainly be shocked into acknowledging how bizarre water is and how taking it for granted is simply a mistake born of ignorance. And after understanding these things about water, you'll likely recognize its existence and abundance on Earth as yet one more suitcase of evidence that the way things are is so dramatically improbable that we must at least wonder, if we are to be intellectually honest, that is, how it can all be possible and whether a God of infinite intelligence may have made things this way intentionally, perhaps even with an eye simply toward freaking us out when we had enough scientific knowledge to understand such things. If, on the other hand, we could forget we ever had encountered water and could come upon it as for the first time, we could not avoid being astonished by it. In one episode of that famous cartoon, The Simpsons, the family visits a water park where one of the scarier rides is called H2O. Metaxas thinks that is, we consider the startling idea that water is deeply strange on a host of levels, calling it H2O might be particular apposite. For example, let's start with asking why ice floats. Why does ice float? We know that when water moves from a liquid to a solid, it turns to ice, which floats. Who can imagine anything else? But it's only because we are so accustomed to water and floating ice that we regard it as somehow normal. But floating ice is not normal. Nearly every substance in creation gets denser as it cools and therefore gets heavier and would thereby sink. So, by the time it gets cold enough to become a solid, it's always denser and heavier than the liquid form of the substance, and therefore, as I said, it sinks. What could be more logical? But in this regard, water happens to not go with the flow, so to speak. On the contrary, water is actually 9% less dense when it freezes into ice and is therefore lighter than liquid water. This is the first strange thing about ice, that it becomes less dense than its liquid form, water, therefore becomes lighter than liquid water, therefore floats. That is strange. It precisely because of this and many of water's other strange properties that life exists on our planet, as we shall explain. But the idea that water floats is even stranger than we might first think. That's because water does get heavier and denser as it gets colder, just as most substances do. But when it cools to 39 degrees Fahrenheit, that process suddenly reverses, after which it gets lighter and less dense. So yes, water that is 70 degrees Fahrenheit is lighter and less dense than water that is 50 degrees Fahrenheit. But for some perplexing reason, water ceases to become denser and heavier at the moment it hits 39 degrees. From that point down to its freezing point of 32 degrees, it changes direction, becoming less dense and heavy. By the time it hits 32 degrees and turns to ice, it is 9% less than the water around it. As we have said, it floats. When it is 9% less dense than the water around it, and therefore it floats. Substances that float in their frozen or solid form are extremely rare. Melt chocolate and you will see. Melt butter or wax. The solid part is denser than the liquid part and it sinks, but not with water. But as we have said, this is not merely a random, strange property. Like most of the oddities already mentioned, this property of water happens to be crucial to the existence of life on Earth. So the thesis is going to be that God made this substance, water, divided it from the land, and made it essential for life, and made it unique and unlike any of the other substances. For example, if ice did not float, lakes and other bodies of water would freeze from the bottom up, completely destroying their ecosystems, or never developing them in the first place. But because ice floats, it forms on the surfaces of lakes and ponds and rivers and Arctic oceans. If it froze from the bottom up, it would cause a runaway freezing of all the water above it, and because it floats on top, it even creates an insulation barrier for the water beneath it, protecting it from the cold above the ice and allowing the life beneath it to survive. But this is one of water's least bizarre qualities. For example, from a chemist's point of view, the freezing and boiling points of water are entirely out of line with what we should expect. The Nobel Prize winning Hungarian biochemist Albert Szent-Györgyi, if I'm probably mispronouncing that name, wrote, quote, "The extraordinary nature of water is born out of the two constants used most frequently for the characterization of substances, melting and boiling points," end quote. We can rather accurately guess the freezing points and boiling points of substances by the sizes of their molecules, but not in the curious case of water, which dramatically defies our expectations. This Hungarian biochemist Albert Szent-Györgyi says that for a molecule its size, water should boil at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Not freeze at 32 degrees, but boil at 32 degrees. That sounds strange to our ears. Of course, water doesn't boil until it reaches 212 degrees Fahrenheit. So Szent-Györgyi also says that according to the size of the water molecule, it ought not to freeze until it reaches the incredibly cold temperature of minus 148 degrees. The presence of liquid water in most regions of the planet is absolutely de rigueur required for life. So if our planet were farther from the sun or closer, or if water froze and evaporated at different temperatures, life here would not be possible. But our planet is not farther from the sun or closer to the sun, and water does not freeze and evaporate at different temperatures. Therefore, life is possible. Water's freezing point is also crucial when we travel straight up in our atmosphere. That's because its very low freezing point is what prevents it from evaporating into outer space. At an altitude of 6 miles where jets fly, the temperature is usually something like 70 degrees below zero. At that very cold temperature, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen still remain gaseous. But of course, water, though made of oxygen and hydrogen, freezes long before it gets that cold. So by the time any water vapor gets that high up in what is called the troposphere, it promptly freezes and drops back down to Earth's surface. If it didn't, it would continue to rise further until the ultraviolet rays in that part of the atmosphere broke it apart into its components of hydrogen and oxygen. The super light hydrogen would swiftly escape the atmosphere, never to return, and Earth would be quickly depleted of water. In fact, it would have been depleted of water eons ago, and life here would never have come to exist. We believe this is what happened on the planet Venus, since it's so close to the sun and does not have a cold troposphere. The reason for most of water's strange properties is the very strong hydrogen bond in the H2O molecule. There's a illustration of it down there, bottom. This is one reason for water's high viscosity and high surface tension, as well as its high polarity, each of which plays a role in making life possible and all three of which often work together to enable water to do things we likely never considered. The extremely high surface tension of water is superseded only by that of mercury. We can observe this property when a water strider manages to walk across the surface of a pond. There's a picture of a water strider on the bottom. Of when we pour water a bit higher than the rim of a glass and it manages to hold together without flowing over. Its surface tension also makes it form into drops much more easily than liquids with lower surface tension. Michael Denton explains that water's high viscosity is particularly important, but who ever thinks about water's viscosity? Nonetheless, it's because water has just the right viscosity that it's able to erode rocks, which turns out to be utterly central to life on Earth, something else most of us likely have never thought about. Who would think that erosion could be in any sense positive, much less central to the flourishing of life on Earth? We think of erosion as somehow destructive and not maybe not beneficial, but we're going to see that it is dramatically central to the flourishing of life on Earth. Water flows much faster than something more viscous like olive oil, and as it flows, it picks up bits of stone and sand, which act like a kind of sandpaper on whatever water flows over, aiding in the process of erosion. And by eroding the rocks over which it flows, the water continues to carry the rock particulates and minerals and metals along, distributing them wherever it goes. This is crucial because these vital minerals and metals become part of the soil wherever the water takes them, and all the places in between. And the plants that drink that water get the nitrates, magnesium, and other minerals they need to survive. Then the animals that drink the water and eat the plants get those vital minerals and metals too, and on it goes. So the erosion then it keeps plants and animals alive, and we consume also those plants and animals, and that's how we get some of our nutrition anyway, apparently. But who would ever think that water's viscosity and ability to erode rocks was intrinsically important to plant and animal life far from where that water had originally come? Water also has a singularly unmatched ability to dissolve nearly anything it comes in contact with. It's therefore called the universal solvent, and this property has to do with the water molecule's high polarity. So as water erodes the rocks and soil over which it flows, much that it carries along from those rocks and soil eventually dissolves to become invisible parts of the water, enabling the water to carry it much further than it could carry larger bits of rock or grains of sand. Michael Denton writes, quote, "It is hard to conceive of a more ideal agent than water for dissolving the vital minerals in Earth's crust," end quote. So water carries both dissolved and undissolved minerals and metals everywhere it flows, feeding innumerable life forms that, if not for the water, would have no way of getting those vital ingredients. Even water's strange property of increasing in volume when it freezes helps erode rocks, because water drawn into the fissure of a rock sometimes freezes, and the expanding ice causes the rock to eventually break apart. But Michael Denton says the power of water to erode rock is so powerful that it ought to have eroded every mountain down to nothing and to have destroyed all life on the planet millions of years ago. Niagara Falls, where the rushing water over the ages has eroded the solid rock so much that the falls are now 7 miles farther back than they were merely 12,000 years ago. This is a dramatic example, but over hundreds of millions of years, even the mildest erosion becomes dramatic. Michael Denton says that the level of erosion in many places is 2 millimeters per year. We don't typically think of that as a lot, but over time it adds up. So in 10 million years, that would erode 20 to 100,000 meters. Mount Everest is less than 10,000 meters high. But if this is the case, how have the mountains of the world managed to avoid being ground down into the ocean many times over? How has life existed on land for 400 million years and in the oceans for 4 billion? The answer is something we knew almost nothing about until the 1960s, and another example of how things work together to create an environment that seems curiously, if not spookily, calibrated to support life. We're talking about plate tectonics. Water erodes rocks, but the moving continental plates work in the opposite direction, continually creating new mountains, for example. We now know that the process of plate tectonics gives our planet its variety of climates and altitudes, and most crucially ensures a constant recycling of all the minerals and metals in our rocks and soils. Denton writes that plate tectonics explain, quote, why the continents exist and persist, why the mountains are never finally ground to sea level, and why the hydrological cycle can replenish the essential mineral content of the terrestrial hydrosphere endlessly over billions of years, ensuring the continuance of life on land, and why the seas have never been depleted of their dissolved salt and mineral content, end quote. We've mentioned that the strange composition of the water molecule, pictured above, with its very strong hydrogen bond and its high polarity, is at the center of most of water's strange properties. But it's also because of the strong hydrogen bond that water does not compress easily, which also happens to be crucially important. Medical science says that because of this quality, blood can be pushed through our veins effectively, as blood is comprised of 80% water. In fact, water's molecular properties make it especially difficult to compress that even at that depth of a mile under the ocean surface, its volume is only compressed by 1%. Is only compressed by 1%. Let's try that again. In fact, water's molecular properties make it especially difficult to compress that even at the depth of a mile under the ocean surface, its volume is only compressed by 1%. We can hardly imagine the pressure underneath more than 5,000 feet of liquid water. After all, it's heavy stuff. A single gallon weighs over 8,000 pounds. As we said, the high surface tension, high viscosity, and high tensile strength of water enable it to do many crucial things. Because of all three, its high surface tension, its high viscosity, and high tensile strength, trees are able to pull water all the way up into their highest branches through the exceedingly tiny capillary pathways, all the way up to the leaves that drink in the sunlight. Via photosynthesis, the sunlight that hits the leaves activates the chlorophyll in them, so that the water breaks apart into hydrogen and oxygen. The oxygen is released into the atmosphere so that we can breathe it, among other things, and the carbon dioxide absorbed by the leaves combines with the hydrogen left behind to create sugars and other carbohydrates that feed the tree. As a result of water's particular viscosity and high surface tension, water is perfectly suited to sink down into various soils while not sinking so quickly that it does not also stay available to the roots of plants for the necessary time. There's an inconceivable amount of water on our planet, 326 quintillion gallons at last count, which helps keep Earth's air temperatures stable. Water helps keep Earth's air temperatures stable. That's because water retains heat extraordinarily well or doesn't conduct it well and remains the same temperature for a considerable time despite the vagaries of temperature in the air above it. So it acts as a coolant when all else around it gets hot and as a heating element when all around it gets cold. Moving on from water, now we'll discuss, is sunlight a happy coincidence? Andrew Parker, author of The Genesis Enigma, is a visiting research fellow at Oxford's Green Templeton College, where he heads up the research team on photonics, structures, and eyes, so he knows something about sunlight. In his book, The Genesis Enigma, Parker cites a coincidence so bizarre that to him it hardly seems possible, and yet there's no question that it's not only possible, but has also been a fact of life on our planet for nearly 4 billion, with a B, years. That coincidence that he has discovered but cannot get over has to do with the sun's output and the transparency of seawater. We will describe this in more detail shortly, but to sum things up, Parker says the sun, quote, has a peak in its energy output in its electromagnetic spectrum, and seawater has a peak in its ability to transmit this electromagnetic spectrum. Strangely enough, and there is no scientific reason for this, Parker emphasizes that there is no scientific reason for this, the two peaks converge on the same narrow window of wavelengths, the visible light range. Considering the vast range of wavelengths in the sun's output, it is indeed a mighty coincidence that this minuscule region is also that which travels the best through seawater. So there's no scientific explanation for what Parker just said. So science is yet to give an answer to that one, and they may never, because we live in a universe in which God gives scientists, because remember, science doesn't say anything, scientists do, as Frank Turek would say. And every time I hear Eric Metaxas say science says, I'm thinking science doesn't say anything, scientists do. But Parker is showing something that science has yet to be able to explain, and there will always be things that science is unable to explain, because if we could understand everything, which new atheists seem to think that science will allow us to be able to do that, they're mistaken, because God has created this universe in such a way that while we can discover much, and science is an incredible tool at being able to do just that, there are some things that are not going to be able to be discovered, because some things are going to be intentionally, I believe, kept mysteries by God so that we will look to Him. He wants us to put our faith in Him, not science or anyone or anything else be the end all of be all of everything. God is the end all be all. We're going to have to face Him, not science, on Judgment Day. So, to explain Parker more clearly, we're going to have to go back to when life appeared on our planet, roughly 3.9 billion years ago. The first life was in the form of single-celled organisms, and how the single-celled organisms came into being from non-life is something that will be taken up in the next chapter of Is Atheism Dead by Eric Metaxas. But let's put that question aside for the moment and simply think about life suddenly existing and then reproducing and reproducing. But science tells us that a serious problem reared its head immediately because the energy or food on our planet was limited. This meant that in time, some scores of millions of years perhaps, it would all be used up, and that would be that. Life would die out. Since life has now been here for nearly 4 billion years, we see that this problem was somehow overcome. But how did this happen, given the very real issue of a limited supply of energy? How did the life that emerged nearly 4 billion years ago continue to exist through vast eons all the way until the present time? What did it eat? If all the energy on Earth was fixed and finite, what happened? Obviously, the single-celled creatures did not care one way or another about solving this problem. They were unaware of their own existence and did not trouble themselves about how they might sustain their species, or any life, into the distant future. Nonetheless, something happened so that life did not run out of fuel and managed to continue through nearly 4 billion years until the present. But what? What happened? According to Parker, not very long after the first life appeared on Earth, a second kind of life appeared called cyanobacteria, which is just the fancy name for blue-green algae. Cyanobacteria are exceedingly tiny, single-celled creatures that possess a strange ability that the previous single-celled creatures did not possess. Cyanobacteria are able to extract energy from beyond our planet, so the finite amount of energy on this planet was suddenly no longer a problem, and life could continue here indefinitely. But how did these single-celled creatures perform this extraordinary trick? Through an ability called photosynthesis, they were able to magically tap into an extraterrestrial energy source. In other words, they were able to use the sunlight shining into the water to feed themselves. It's almost as if they had 93 million mile-long straws and could drink energy directly from the sun. Of course, that wasn't necessary because these cyanobacteria simply could float along in the water and let the sunlight come to them. And that sunlight, via photosynthesis, was turned into food and the problem was solved. But this is where we bump into the bizarre quote-unquote coincidence that knocked Parker for a loop and that he sees as so bizarre that it cannot be a coincidence. That's because what these cyanobacteria were able to do 4 billion years ago and still do 4 billion years later is only possible because of two simultaneous and two totally unrelated, outrageous quote-unquote coincidences. Each of these coincidences is too much to take in, but the two of them together are simply stupefying and force us to wonder if something else is at work other than a coincidence, other than random chance. So let's talk about each of the two coincidences. The first coincidence has to do with sunlight. It's the thumbnail at the top right corner. Parker and Denton both explained that the sun emits an impossibly vast variety of electromagnetic energy. We're familiar with sunlight, but that is a very, very tiny part of the electromagnetic energy coming from the sun. The electromagnetic energy ranges from infrared radiation, microwave radiation, and radio waves, which have long wavelengths, for ultraviolet radiation, X-rays, and gamma rays, which have shorter wavelengths. The spectrum of electromagnetic energy emitted by the sun is actually so vast that to appreciate it, we may imagine a deck of playing cards. And that deck of playing cards stretches beyond our atmosphere and all the way to the next galaxy called the Andromeda Galaxy. In the picture down there, I tried to find a distant picture of that you could see the Andromeda Galaxy and the Milky Way in the same picture. And so we've got a deck of cards stretching between the two galaxies. Now you understand that picture. That's essentially the range of the electromagnetic spectrum emitted by our sun. So the electromagnetic spectrum emitted by our sun stretches beyond our galaxy's atmosphere and into the next galaxy. That's wild. And then we learn that visible light, meaning sunlight, is a very, very, very tiny part of that spectrum. To imagine just how tiny, we should think of 2 or 3 of the cards in the middle of the deck. I added 2 cards to the bottom of the picture to give you an idea. Remember that the deck of cards representing all the energy coming from the sun is so tall, it would stretch beyond the Milky Way to the next galaxy. And the sunlight part of that spectrum is the equivalent of a couple of cards. But this is where it gets dramatically stranger. 70% of all the electromagnetic energy coming from the sun just happens to fall within that impossibly narrow range represented by 2 cards in that nearly infinite deck. So 70% of all the electromagnetic energy that comes from the sun falls within the range of 2 playing cards. That's wild. It's within the tiniest of ranges within that outrageously vast spectrum that the sun puts out 70% of all its energy. That is wild. Of course, this is amazing and strange, but far more amazing and strange is the fact that there's no understandable scientific reason for this to be so. It just so happens, Metaxas puts in italics, it just so happens to be the case, and just so happens to be extremely lucky from the perspective of life on Earth. Or he puts it in italics so that the reader will get the hint. It's not by chance. It's not just lucky. It's intelligent design. It's fine tuning. It's theism. So we've looked at sunlight being a happy coincidence. Now we're going to look at seawater being a happy coincidence. But as we've said, there's a second and similarly bizarre coincidence, totally unrelated to the first one, and it has to do with seawater. Once again, for no scientific reason whatever, the seawater on the surface of our planet just happens to be able to transmit sunlight's visible energy dramatically better than any other of the vast varieties of energy it emits. We don't understand why seawater and seawater on the surface of our planet can transmit sunlight's visible energy so well. It's just a strange but true property of seawater that scientists have observed. But to make this point more clearly, we've discovered the seawater absorbs all the energy that comes from the sun in every part of the vast spectrum of electromagnetic energy. So all the energy in the electromagnetic spectrum, energy with long wavelengths such as infrared radiation, microwave radiation, and radio waves, and energy with short wavelengths such as ultraviolet radiation, X-rays, and gamma rays, is absorbed by seawater. All the energy in the electromagnetic spectrum is absorbed by seawater except for sunlight. Sunlight is not absorbed by the electromagnetic spectrum. For some reason, seawater does not absorb sunlight, but instead strangely allows sunlight to pass through it. We cannot understand why seawater lets sunlight pass through it. But when we couple this entirely shocking coincidence with the previous entirely shocking coincidence about sunlight, we may be permitted to wonder what sort of madness we've encountered. What in the world is going on? Like Andrew Parker, Michael Denton repeats the facts simply so we cannot miss it. Quote from Michael Denton: water strongly absorbs electromagnetic radiation in every region of the spectrum except for the visible region, the only region in the entire spectrum useful for photobiology. Water, in one of the most staggeringly fortuitous coincidences in all of nature, lets through only the right light in an infinitesimally tiny region of the electromagnetic spectrum. Quote by Denton. So seawater absorbs almost all the energy from the sun, except for that impossibly tiny part of the spectrum we call sunlight. So seawater absorbs everything but sunlight. That it lets pass through. Wow. And that sunlight hits the cyanobacteria in the seawater, and those cyanobacteria just happen to be able to convert that sunlight via photosynthesis into food. What both Denton and Parker marvel at more than they can properly express, however, is that these two bizarre peaks in sunlight and seawater have no scientific reason whatsoever to match up. They have nothing to do with each other. They are each absurdly small points in the spectrum, tinier than we can possibly imagine, and yet for no reason at all that makes the slightest sense they happen to coincide perfectly. And only because they coincide perfectly was life possible nearly 4 billion years ago and is life possible today. Only because of this most bizarre of all coincidences, can cyanobacteria draw limitless energy from the impossibly distant sun. And because of the unfathomable convergence of two seemingly impossibilities, does life on Earth have a limitless source of energy. Of course, this outrageously strange phenomenon in our seawater lies at the heart of almost everything else in the life cycle of our planet. The ability of cyanobacteria to take in sunlight through the water isn't isolated. It's connected to all the life on our planet and formed the foundation of all the life that has followed ever since. But let me guess. It evolved by random chance, those properties? I think not. Parker explains that the cyanobacteria extracted not only water from their environment, but also carbon dioxide. In return, the cyanobacteria gave the atmosphere oxygen, an oxygenated atmosphere. Parker's quoting here. An oxygenated atmosphere is far more conducive to life, and the protective ozone layer that formed in our atmosphere guarded the Earth's surface from the sun's high-energy ultraviolet rays, which destroyed biochemical material. End quote. Not to drop one's jaw at such things seems at least inappropriate, if not downright rude, Metaxas says in his humorous way. Can we not admit that on some occasions pure and unbridled astonishment is the only fitting response? This is what science now tells us is the state of these things. But what are we to make of it? How is it that these things happen to seem so perfectly designed and fine-tuned for life? In many respects, it all seems rather humbling. But what makes it all the more strange is that it is only because of recent advances in science that we can understand these things. As science progresses, more and more such elements of fine-tuning are being discovered to where they become such a veritable mountain we can hardly stop seeing it, even if we might, for one reason or another, prefer not to see it. Again, the irony of the situation can hardly be avoided. Scientific advances have made it increasingly impossible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Let me say that again. Science advances have made it increasingly impossible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. What to do? We know that sunlight and seawater did not calibrate themselves, nor that natural selection had anything to do with their having these strange properties, nor help these bizarre properties in each of them to match up so perfectly like two bullets striking each other with such precision that they both ceased to move, moving forward and together drop vertically. The precision of this is like the precision of the collision in which the moon was formed. If either that event or this coincidence had happened in any way ever so slightly differently, life on Earth would not exist. Can we stare at these things long enough to appreciate their miraculousness? Or shall we look away and pretend we've never seen any of it? At what point does a thinking person simply say uncle and move on? That's the end of chapter 5 of Is Atheism Dead by Eric Metaxas. Next time is chapter 6. How did life originate? Or you can't get here from there. So, thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe. If it's available, please consider supporting this ministry by purchasing the published work, the volume on the first 30 chapters of the Book of Psalms, Pinnacles and Plateaus, Meditations with the Psalmist. If you're interested in that and cannot find it online, please contact me directly and I'll see if I can help you with that. Meanwhile, I hope you have a blessed rest of your day.